Welcome to Right with God through Jesus. I pray that these lessons will help in your walk with God. Welcome back to the lessons. It's good to have you back. We are starting a new series of lessons today that are going to talk about Israel and how it relates. The first lesson in this series is God's covenant with Abraham. And the idea that we'll be exploring, God still calls people to enter into covenant with him. The key verse for today is Genesis 15:6. Abram believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. It's important to consider what people mean when they say, I am blessed. God has blessed in many different ways. We see in Genesis how people were blessed by God and how it was lost. Scripture follows the unfolding God's greatest blessing, his plan to redeem humanity. Genesis 12 helps us understand God's desire for his creation. It's rooted in the concept of relationship. God's plan is to restore humans to relationship that was there before Genesis 3. Blessing and covenant needs to be looked at in the light of God's plan of redemption, which is sealed by his covenant, which begins to take shape in Genesis 12. Okay, so the first part of the lesson is called of God, covenant instituted. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 5, Abraham's calling. Now, I'm going to read a couple of verses, which is different than what we have been doing, but I hope that it will be meaningful in each area as I read the 2 or 3 verses. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Abraham put his future fully in God's hands and left everything behind in blind obedience. But we see his faith encompassed more than a change of location. Abraham originally called Abram until God changed his name. His father, Terah, started to move his family to Canaan, but settled in Haran, which was a stopping point for travelers. And we are also told that Abraham and Sarah were childless. So those are some of the facts that are coming out. Now, the word covenant means treaty, agreement, or promise. This was normally between a ruler and his subordinate. This case, God is the benefactor of this covenant. It depends solely on him. Abraham and all humanity have a responsibility to follow God's commands as the people of covenant. Abraham went to Canaan, but he didn't go there alone. He took his wife and nephew. We are also introduced to the word blessing here. We see the restoration of God's blessing would come through one man, Abraham. This is describing a pivotal moment for humanity, drawing attention back to the accounts of creation and the fall. The sevenfold promise that was made to Abraham was, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you famous. You will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Making him famous had to do with his identity as much as impact on the world. He and his children and grandchildren would exemplify greatness and serving and serve for the delivery of the divine blessing. Abraham's promise of greatness included the large number of descendants, which came through a miracle whose blessing would reach to all people of the earth. This would occur as people acknowledged the one true God. Abraham's descendants represented the salvation that would come through Christ. Since Christ's ascension, the church, God's people everywhere, points the world back to Christ, introducing them to the blessing of God they can enjoy today and forever. Those who responded to Abraham's negativity and ridiculed him would receive God's curse. Remember, Abraham's name focused on his role and character. Cursing him amounted to cursing the giver of blessing. Rejecting God's plan is rejecting him. We continue to function as Abraham's children so all the earth might be blessed through Abraham. What began with Abraham continue as God's people declare the salvation and new life through Christ. And then we turn to Genesis 15, verses 1 through 21. The calling is confirmed by covenant. And we want to read some verses there. Verse 9, and he said, take me a heifer of 3 years old, and she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He took unto him all of these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds he divided he not. And then verse 17, and it came to pass that when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between them. And the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. That was verse 18 that I just read. God affirms his presence and blessing to Abraham. These verses describe a divine encounter in which God reminds us he will always fulfill his promises. Genesis 15 details God's covenant with Abraham. The I am statements indicates God is the one true sovereign God. The covenant relationship built on the foundation of God's nature and character. God reminded Abraham of his promise given 10 years earlier. Abraham did not see how an elderly couple could become parents of a great nation, so he considered adopting a servant to fulfill the position of heir. God told him this would not be necessary because the number of Abraham's natural descendants would outnumber the stars overhead. Abraham's faith was a personal confidence in God. His identity is in God's promise. Verse 17 and 18 follows the treaty format common to the ancient Near East, but in Abraham's covenant, only a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, which signify God's presence, passed through the animals. This was indicating that the promise rested on God alone. God's blessing are not clear God's blessings are clear in these verses. God will uphold his portion, and no human could stop its completion. God will fulfill his promise. The promise was fulfilled after Abraham's death. All kinds of hardship came to his lineage, including the slavery in Egypt. But deliverance would come, and Abraham's descendants would fill the land as God had promised. Through them, the entire earth would be blessed. And then we turn to the second part of the lesson, Covenant sign commanded. Genesis 17, 1 through 8. The covenant is confirmed. And I want to read a verse there. Verse number 2. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. Human nature makes it easy for people to focus on negative. But God reminds us of his many promises. God reminds Abraham of his promise by changing his name to Abraham. He had a son by Sarah's servant. They had struggled to have children, and he was having trouble reconciling how God's promise would come about with him not having a son. God did not abandon Abraham or change his promise. God's covenant was lasting, and he did not let Abraham's imperfection change that. God declared that Abraham would bear countless descendants with Sarah. God announced this is my covenant, outlined the obligations. For God himself, for Abraham, and for Sarah. Each section accompanied a sign: Abraham's name change, Sarah's name change, and circumcision. This wasn't an equal partnership. God's people would always depend on him for the promises to come to pass. Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of a multitude. The changing of their names was a reminder that they and their descendants carried the promises of God. And then we turn to Genesis 17, verses 9 through 14. The sign, the covenant, is identified. And we're going to read just verse 10 out of those verses. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. The people confirmed God's covenant through obedient response. Abraham was to initiate a sign that would confirm the covenant. Abraham's seed would be the means to which God's everlasting covenant would be brought forth and proclaimed. God commanded the physical sign to accompany his covenant would be circumcision. The significance of this is the permanent physical alteration would signify the everlasting nature of the covenant. It reminded people of the calling from and the relationship with God. It also showed people's obligation to walk after him in holiness, which was later established in the law. It also carries over into the New Testament as a command to Christ followers who have been set apart from the world by God for his purposes. New Testament believers, the sign of circumcision would endure, but it would be a circumcision of the heart, which are our desires, aspirations, and values, are purified and set apart for God. Now let me reiterate that because I want to make that clear. New Testament believers, the sign of circumcision would endure, but it would be a circumcision of the heart, which are our desires, aspirations, and values are purified and set apart for God. And then we turn to the third part of the lesson, Abraham tested regarding the covenant. Genesis 21, verses 1 through 8. God's promise comes alive in Isaac. And then we look at 21, we're going to read verses 2 and 3. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son, and in his old age, and at the set time which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, who Sarah bare him, Isaac. Most of God's covenant would be fulfilled after Abraham's time. Abraham's experience shows us that God's promises do not grow weaker or fade away at times. When Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, God brought to pass the promise of a child. This was the opening scene of God's plan to bless humanity. Even though it's a short account of Isaac's birth, it focuses entirely on God as a promise keeper. Isaac's name means laugh or to laugh. It recalls Sarah's laughter at the notion that she would have a baby at 90. God honored his promise, and Abraham and Sarah's faith, as weak as it was, became sight. And then we turn to Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19. Abraham is victorious through testing. So we're going to read verses 1, 2, and 11 and 12. Verse number 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, I am here. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee. And then verses 10, 11, and 12, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. This is one of the most familiar stories in the Old Testament. We do not want to fail to grasp the message of faith. Abraham is told to sacrifice his miracle child. We are not told what God's intentions are. We only hear Abraham's reflections on what's happening. His faith was not shaken. When the sacrifice is halted, God says, Because you have obeyed, I will certainly bless you. God's blessing was never in doubt. God's omniscience caused him to know Abraham's faith. Faith is more than mental assent. It is a matter of obedience. Abraham feared God. This might be described as realizing God has life and death in his hands, and we should live accordingly. Abraham shows us that obedience is inseparable from true faith. Now, the takeaways. How the covenant given to Abraham fits into God's overall plan is what we see here. We see also the importance of God's declaration of his promise to Abraham. And then the third thing we see is note how faith is demonstrated through obedience. Lord, I come before you now. As I pray this prayer, I pray that all of us will realize, like Abraham, if we really have faith, then we obey. And I pray that we can follow through and obey whatever you give us to do. Now, Lord, bless all those under the sound of my voice, and we will thank you for it. Amen.